For nearly a decade, James II and his wife kept a secret hidden from the English court. A secret that had the power to destroy them both in an instant. King Charles I was such a bad king that the English people beheaded him, the only English monarch to ever meet such a fate. But the punishment didn't end when his head hit the floor. His children, including the future James II, would have to deal with the fallout for the rest of their lives. James II may have had a cursed life, but you never would have predicted it when he was born. As the King of England's second son, James could look forward to a cushy life of obscene riches and little real responsibility. He received the finest education and received lofty titles such as Duke of York and Lord High Admiral when he was still in diapers. But though little James was too young to realise it, there were storm clouds on the horizon. The First English Civil War broke out between the Royalists and Oliver Cromwell's parliamentarians. And even though Prince James was still just 9 years old, he soon found himself witnessing the horrors of battle firsthand. Both James and his older brother were there when fighting began at the Battle of Edge Hill, and they were there when things started to go south. Charles ordered James to escape the palace by any means necessary. James complied and made his daring escape in 1648. He bade farewell to his father, unaware he would never see him again. Not long after James fled England, King Charles I ran out of time. Parliament found him guilty of treason and sentenced him to death. James never got to see his father before the end, but two of his siblings who remained in England, Elizabeth and Henry, were permitted to bid Charles a tearful goodbye. The axe fell at around 2 p.m. on January 30th, 1649. For the first time before or since, an English monarch was executed by his own people. Over the following years, James's older brother, now King Charles II, in his mind at least, tried to retake control of England, but his attempts quickly fizzled out. In 1654, Oliver Cromwell was Lord Protector of England, and the royalist cause was dead in the water. James, whose entire life had been planned out since birth, suddenly had no future. What was he going to do? In a way, James had lost everything. In a more literal way, he was still fabulously wealthy and politically important. So, despite his calamitous circumstance, James still managed to land on his feet. He took refuge in France and found himself a job in the French army. And though he was still shy of 20, James surprisingly found himself right at home on the battlefield. Anyone who assumed Prince James was some spoiled royal dandy soon learned otherwise. While fighting for legendary French General Turenne, James proved himself a brave and inspiring soldier, and quickly moved up the ranks of Turenne's army. But while James fought in another man's wars, he never forgot about his birthright back in England. Around the same time, he also decided to settle down and find a wife, and one particularly beautiful woman caught his eye. Her name was Anne Hyde. She had no idea what she was getting herself into. James II met Anne Hyde while they were both in exile in the Netherlands. After a few short years of courtship, James decided to put his money where his mouth was. He promised he would marry her. To him, it seemed like an obvious gesture. Little did he realise, things were about to get a lot more complicated. When James promised to marry Anne Hyde, he was just the forgotten son of a beheaded king. But in 1658, Oliver Cromwell died. His Commonwealth collapsed soon after, and by 1660, James's brother returned to England and was proclaimed King Charles II. Suddenly, James' life was back on track, as if the last 10 years hadn't ever happened. If only it were that simple. James ignited controversy almost the moment he returned to England. When he had been just a soldier, proposing to Anne Hyde was no big deal. But as the king's brother and second in line to the throne, that's a whole different story. James had barely been back home for 5 minutes, and already he was making powerful enemies. We've seen this story before. Edward IV wanted to marry Elizabeth Woodville. Robb Stark wanted to marry Talissa. When powerful royals decided to marry commoners for love, it rarely ends well. Unsurprisingly then, nearly everyone in England was against James marrying Anne. In a disturbing twist, Anne's own ruthlessly ambitious father allegedly suggested Charles have her executed rather than let her marry James. But there was one thing he didn't count on. Plot twist. James's brother Charles actually approved of the match. Charles and James never saw eye to eye, but the king hoped that the strong-willed Anne Hyde might have a positive impact on his brother. So, despite opposition from all sides, James and Anne married in secret in 1660, soon after the Restoration. But their happily ever after quickly fell apart. As if this marriage wasn't scandalous enough already, Anne gave birth to the couple's first child just 2 months after. However, anyone who raised an eyebrow at the timing didn't have long to raise objections. The boy, Charles, died in infancy. The couple mourned their first child, unaware that this was just the beginning of their nightmare. James and Anne lost their first child in infancy. Then, the same fate befell 5 more of their offspring. Only 2 of their children would survive, Mary and Anne. Perhaps because he and Anne lost so many children, James openly cherished his 2 daughters. Most men of this era would have been disappointed in only having girls, but James loved Mary and Anne and played with them just like any ordinary father. That didn't stop Mary from stabbing him in the back when the time came. King Charles hoped that Anne Hyde would be a positive influence on his brother, and for the most part, he was right. Anne was utterly devoted to James, and she provided valuable counsel when he had to make important decisions. Apparently, he frequently showed his appreciation with obscene gestures of public affection, something that scandalized the court even further. One thing is for sure, James wouldn't be half the man without his wife by his side, which makes what he did to her all the more cruel. Plenty of powerful men kept mistresses, but James took it to another level. Sure, he had a wife and 2 daughters, but that wouldn't stop his eye from wandering, and he wasn't subtle about it. One observer in court described him as the most unguarded ogre of his time. Plenty of men in London noted that they'd seen James eyeing up their wives, but James wanted to do a lot more than just look. James had many mistresses, but perhaps the most important was Arabella Churchill. They began their affair in 1665, and soon James made sure she received a post as his wife's lady-in-waiting. That must have been hard for his wife to take, but it got so much worse. Churchill quickly became pregnant. She gave birth to the child, and then another. After all of Anne's miscarriages, watching her husband's mistress give him not 1, but 2 children must have stung. But for Anne, at least there was one silver lining. Anne Hyde was comely, witty, and stylish. Before she married James, plenty of suitors had vied for her hand. But all of James's mistresses had one thing in common. no one thought they were attractive. One observer called Arabella Churchill pale-faced and nothing but skin and bone. Another gossiper assumed that James's mistresses must have been given to him by his priest as a penance. If you were Anne, would that make it better or worse? James liked to spend his time macking on his beautiful wife or sneaking around with his plain-faced mistresses, but he did actually have real duties. After his brother became king, he took command of the Royal Navy, and this would turn out to be the darkest part of his legacy. While fighting with the Dutch, James saw an extremely lucrative new opportunity: the transatlantic slave trade. And as the head of the Royal Navy, he saw his chance to get in on it. As head of the Royal Navy and governor of the Royal African Company, James fortified British's position along the slave coast and greatly expanded the exportation of African slaves. In fact, James's RAC shipped more enslaved men, women, and children to America than any other organization in the history of the transatlantic slave trade. The RAC branded many of those slaves with large DY on their chest, DY standing for Duke of York, so no one would ever forget who was responsible. His role in the transatlantic slave trade is by far the darkest part of James II's legacy. But that's not the only way his name resonates in history. James was putting his stamp on England's foreign territories, but they still needed him in the homeland too. In 1666, a fire broke out in a bakery on Pudding Lane. The blaze quickly spread throughout the city's wooden buildings like they were kindling, and soon nearly the entire city of London was engulfed in flames. To make matters worse, the city's mayor allegedly fled the city in a panic, so there was no one to bring the fire under control. That is, until James took over. James was never the most popular man in England, but his actions during the Great Fire of London won the hearts of the people. He helped restore order as the panicked residents of the city turned into a mob, and strategically ordered the demolition of specific buildings to help curb the blaze. By the time the ash had settled, the people of London saw James as a hero for about a minute. Soon after, he did something that made them hate him forever. James was English, but he had spent a lot of time in France, where he was exposed to Catholic practices for the first time. By the late 1660s, under the influence of his wife, James took the Catholic Eucharist, a fact he desperately tried to keep a secret. James was well aware that his Catholic faith could be dangerous in the passionately Anglican English court. Still, I doubt he realised what a disaster it would become. In the years that followed James's conversion, paranoia about Catholic influence in England reached a fever pitch. In 1673, Parliament introduced a new Test Act, which required all officials to take an oath disavowing Catholic principles and to receive the Anglican Eucharist. The jig was up. James refused and relinquished his post as Lord High Admiral. Suddenly, all of England knew that the King's brother was a hated Catholic, and it was only going to get worse. James's conversion ignited Anglicans' long-simmering paranoia that Catholics were trying to take over England. Soon, a controversial clergyman named Titus Oates announced that he had uncovered a plot by Catholics to assassinate Charles and put James on the throne. Tensions in the kingdom were already high, and Oates's popish plot made them explode. Eventually, authorities proved that Oates had completely fabricated the popish plot, but by then, it was too late. Anti-Catholic hysteria had swept England, and at least 22 people had been frivolously executed in the madness. James escaped the controversy relatively unscathed, but his faith still meant there was a target on his back, and that wasn't going to change anytime soon. People hated James's Catholicism so much that one minister tried to pass an exclusion bill that would cut him out of the line of succession. Lucky for James, that bill didn't pass, and wouldn't you know, his brother, King Charles II, wasn't looking so good. By 1680, James was the Lord High Commissioner of Scotland, but with his brother looking more and more ill with each passing day, James prepared to move back to London to await whatever might happen. King Charles II suffered a sudden apoplectic fit in February 1685 and died soon after. With no children of his own, the crown passed to his brother, the Duke of York, who became King James II of England and Ireland and King James VII of Scotland. Although the people hated James's Catholicism, they were tired of messy successions, so they readily accepted him as their king. But if James thought it was going to be easy, he had another thing coming. The Anglicans were uncomfortable with James on the throne, but at least they knew that his two daughters were good Protestant girls. Hopefully, they would take the throne soon, reverse all of James's pro-Catholic policies, and everything could go back to normal. Then James had a baby with his new, very Catholic wife, Mary of Modena. For the Anglicans, a Catholic heir to the throne was the final straw. Influential Anglicans quickly tried to spread the rumour that the child wasn't really the king's, but really that he'd been smuggled into the Queen's bedchamber. When that didn't work, they kicked things up a notch. England had toppled one king just a few decades prior. Why not do it again? But instead of going the whole blood on your hands execution route, a cadre of powerful Anglicans did something arguably even more shocking. They invited a foreign prince to come take the country by force. As if it wasn't messy enough already, that foreign prince was William of Orange, James's own son-in-law. William invaded England with an army, and immediately several of James's key officers defected to his side. But the worst betrayal came from one of his own. James's own daughter Anne abandoned him and joined her sister on William's side. James must have been heartbroken. At least that would explain his shocking next move. While there was a foreign army gathering on his shores, James still had the numerical advantage. All he needed to do was attack, but at the last minute he lost his nerve. Maybe it was because those close to him had abandoned ship, but for whatever reason, James II of England simply gave up. James had an opportunity to cement his rule with a decisive victory. Instead, he turned his tail and fled to France. As he left London, he symbolically threw the Great Seal of the realm into the Thames. William's force captured him before he could escape Great Britain, but by then, James was a shell of who he once was. Soon after his forces captured James, William made a shocking decision. In one final humiliation, he had his men let James go. No strings, no questions. He must have realised that killing James would have only made him a martyr for rebels to rally around. Clearly, Williams didn't consider James to be a threat. And he was right. William and his wife, James's daughter Mary, jointly ruled England following the Glorious Revolution. After them, the throne passed to Mary's sister, Anne, who ruled as Queen Anne of Great Britain. With no children of her own, after Anne, the throne passed to a distantly related German cousin, George of Hanover, ending nearly a century of rule by the House of Stuart. James was forced to watch from afar as everything he'd ever done for England was picked apart bit by bit. His father was executed by his own people, but in a way, James's ultimate fate was even more painful. He spent his final years as a forgotten penitent, with nothing to do but ruminate on a life of failures. After seeing the dawn of a new century, James passed suddenly from a brain hemorrhage in 1701. Years later, as if he hadn't been humiliated enough in his life, his tomb was desecrated during the French Revolution. Thanks for watching History Expose. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.